Woohoo! Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another briefing by Tim Langley and Dan Harada. We just had an election a couple of days ago, and we are here today to talk about what it means, where we're going, and what's going to happen next. Today is November 1st. Welcome to November 1st, 2024. Good afternoon, Dan.
Good afternoon. Thank you for being here.
Dan, 6 days ago, 465 seats of the lower house went up for grabs. They were elected on Sunday, and we're still dealing with the fallout from that. In an epical move, the LDP lost the majority that they had held for so many years, and it opens up a huge can of worms, and that's what we're going to talk about. You and I talk pretty frequently on this channel, maybe once a month, but over the last, maybe 2 months, we've been talking almost every other week. We've got a briefing today to bring our audience up to speed on what's going on and what it means. And probably since the Diet will open up on the 11th of this month, sometime after that, we need to brief our audience once again on who is the Prime Minister, who is the Cabinet, what's going to be happening next before the end of the year. And we roll into the formal Diet session, which starts in January. Dan, any comments on that?
No, absolutely not. I think the election of a prime minister is already a foregone conclusion, and Mr. Isiba will be given a second term.
Mm-hmm. So if we can see the first slide, Maya, it displays for everyone in the circle, the gray circle, what the constitution of, or the distribution was before the election. And you can see that in the gray spot, Komeito and LDP holds better than a majority. And then the colorful circle is describing what the distribution of seats are right now. And you can see that even the Komeito and LDP coalition does not eclipse 50%. And this is the pickle that the Prime Minister finds himself in right now. Dan?
Exactly. So in order to get to a majority, he has to make a deal with somebody else in the opposition. And luckily for him, he has found a volunteer, Tamaki-san, the head of one of the opposition parties. So the blue section, which is now what you see, is going to become red, a little more red, with a majority for a new coalition.
Okay, so the blue section here indicates the Constitutional and Democratic Party, which did surprisingly well. The LDP did surprisingly poorly. And the Democratic Party for the People, Mr. Tamaki's political organization, they grew by 4 times. They could have won a couple more seats if they had enough confidence to have a couple of more candidates in their proportional list, Dan.
Yes, I mean, the Tamaki-san was elated. And,
surprised?
As you said, the only problem, they didn't have enough candidates to get more seats. But now they have the seats, and they will, most in all likelihood, be in the government.
Yes. So, Dan, this is something that you and I do for a living. People pay us money to advise them and to push their issues through the Diet or through the bureaucracy. And even for somebody like Mr. Tamaki, he too was surprised at the outcome of this last election. The LDP was not expected to do so poorly. In fact, when Mr. Ishiba formed his government, not less than a month ago, his Secretary General insisted that he have a very quick election in order to prevent the opposition parties from coalescing, from dividing seats, from dividing votes, for maybe cooperating in some certain tough election districts. And as a consequence of having that election very quickly, one could say that they end up with this result. It could have been worse, maybe if they delayed the election. What's your view on that?
Well, everything can get any time worse, but I mean, the result for the LDP is staggering. They lost almost 60 seats.
That's right. Not only did they lose almost 60 seats, Dan, but their coalition partner lost the president, the newly elected president of the Komeito. He was the second in command for at least 12 or 15 years under the tutelage of the former head of the Komeito party. And he was not but elected president, but 2 weeks before the election, and he lost his Diet seat, and he resigned as being president of the Komeito just the other day.
Yes, maybe, I mean, some of the Komeito voters were upset with what Komeito did in the slush fund scandals, and that did cost them definitely some things. And for Ishiba-san, it cost him his job. Yes,
it's surprising that the amount of ire felt by the voters spilled over to Komeito, and I think that there was another revelation that came out even in the final days of the election. That is the 20 million yen that was distributed to some of the districts that were in which an LDP candidate was running, who was not endorsed by the party, but still that district received a lot of money to run the campaign and to make sure that LDP voters stuck with the LDP. And I think with Mr. Ishiba on the stump, on the trucks, with all the microphones saying, this is not, this is not dirty money. This is not public money that we used. It was the right thing to do, but we're going to clean up the LDP. We're not going to be about money and politics anymore. And I think that rang a little bit false to most of the voters. And not only did they not vote for the LDP, but as a consequence, they also didn't vote for Komeito, the coalition partner.
Yeah, the 20 million thing was really the straw that broke the camel's back. Mm-hmm. I mean, it was the timing could not have been worse. And the explanation which Mr. Ishiba gave, well, he didn't have much to explain, but at least he tried something. But the explanation which he gave wasn't very convincing. The result of that, Komeito lost almost 66.
Yeah, we're in the middle, we're at the tail end of the U.S. election. And frequently there is the October surprise. We're now in November. The election for the U.S. president is in 5 days. But this was almost like an October surprise that lambasted the prime minister and the party in the final days of the election.
Yes, we will never know who was responsible for it. At the end of the day, it must have been Ishiba-san, but very, very poor judgment on his part. And the result is here.
Right. One of the other things, Dan, that you and I have been discussing for all this year is the damage and the destruction that has gone on to the faction system. And for people like you and I who have been seeped in LDP politics and for a long time, it was the faction system that pretty much dictated how Japanese government operates and who's going to be prime minister and who's going to have certain cabinet positions. And that was pretty much washed out with the slush fund scandal, and also Mr. Kishida saying that there's not going to be any more factions. If you have a faction, you need to resign. You need to tell people how much money you receive, and then you need to receive penance for that, or you need to have some sort of a punishment for that. Cleanse the LDP, and then let's come back strong. But I think the damage was done to the faction system is so enormous. If we can have the slide that shows the distribution before the election and after the election of the various factions. Thank you. Dan, any comments on this? Look at what's happened to the former Abe faction.
Well, I mean, it's not surprising. I mean, the Abe faction was at the center of the whole thing, so that they took a bigger beatings than the other ones. It stands for the course, but still, the graph shows it was devastating on the Abe faction.
Right. I think probably part of the logic for the have election now or have election later was, in any event, we're going to lose some seats. We're going to lose the admiration of the voters, and for the members of the LDP, the registered members, they're not going to be as enthusiastic. Maybe they won't show up and vote. And you can see in this graph, please keep the graph up. You can see in this graph that everybody lost out, but in the final washout, the ASO faction, which is the only remaining formal faction, actually is the largest faction now within the LDP.
Yes, and Mr. Asso's voice, which was already very loud, is going to get even louder now, as the graph indicates, because he's now the head of the largest faction, no longer the head of the second largest faction. So that will increase his voice in the management of the affairs.
Right. And we haven't heard much from him. We haven't heard much coming from his office or from his lips. He's not very much in the limelight, but Mr. Tamaki sure is. Every single day, every newspaper front and center, Mr. Tamaki is talking about his availability or his inavailability to join in a coalition with the LDP. But I might, if there are certain concessions that are made. I think right now it's still up in the air, although discussions are being had, Dan.
I would go a little one step further than you. I think it has gone too fast. I mean, both sides would lose face if their proposed, let's call it merger, would collapse. I think it has gone too far. I mean, it's a foregone, in my book, it's a foregone conclusion that will be a three-party coalition in the government.
Okay. So in terms of bringing the audience up to speed, there are a couple of foregone conclusions. One is that at the end of the day, Mr. Ishiba is still going to continue to be prime minister. And at the end of the day, it's going to be a three-party coalition with the Democratic People's Party.
Completely agreed.
Okay.
Completely agreed.
So let's talk a little bit about the concessions that Mr. Tamaki is insisting on in order for him to come over so that the LDP can weigh in a little bit more. So as the first graph shows, they don't have 50%. They need to have at least 50% of the seats in the lower house in order to control, in order to name all of the committee chairs, in order to be able to name the members of each of the individual committees. So the committee structure comes before a bill is offered onto the Diet floor and they vote on it. So there's a lot of action that goes on in the committees. That's really where a lot of the blood is spilled, and that's where policy is actually beaten down. But if you don't have control of the committee chairs and at least can select 50% of the people that are sitting in that committee, you have pandemonium. And that's the reason why the LDP is fighting so hard to get beyond that threshold so that they can at least name the committee chairs and the majority of the committee members. Dan?
Yeah, well, with Tamaki-san aboard, the problem is being solved.
Yes, right. So if we can have the slide on the members of the cabinet. So there are two people that fell out of the running because they weren't elected. Two people, the Minister of Justice and the Minister of Agriculture, they lost their elections. And so they were in the cabinet. The cabinet presumptively is still sitting. They haven't been dismissed, but they haven't been reinitiated. But certainly these two fellows are no longer members of the Diet. They they could be members of the cabinet, but that's just not going to happen. So there are 2 vacancies there. And in fact, we have to point out that there is a vacancy in the prime ministership as well, Dan.
Yes, and it is most likely that as a bargaining tool, Tamaki-san will insist to have 1 cabinet post. He may insist on having 2, but realistically, he will only get 1. And luckily for him, there are 2 vacant slots, as the graph indicates, and 1 will most likely go to him, or to his nominee. That's a different story, but at least to his party.
Mm-hmm. So that horse trading is going on right now. The diet was initially set to collect on the 7th. That means that a letter is delivered to His Majesty to have his approval to open the diet. They receive that authorization, and then he comes over to open the diet. That date from the 7th was moved to the 11th. So they bought another additional 4 days, not a whole lot of time. But I think once the results of the election became obvious, the people who controlled diet affairs decided to move it from the 7th to the 11th. So that comes a little bit later. And the first order of business is to elect the prime minister. Typically in Japanese meetings, what's happening in the meeting has already been decided beforehand. So what's going to happen on the 11th is an election for the prime minister. And probably that's the only item of business that will be done on that day, Dan. Is that correct?
Yes, because it takes time. His Majesty has to come and has to go to both houses. And that's where the entire business of the day will be devoted to that. Yes.
A lot of pomp. Go ahead.
It might take a little longer if for some reason in the first round Ishiba-san was not elected. So that's make it a little longer. But anyway, that's the business on the 11th.
Okay, so we're not quite sure yet, even though typically when a meeting is had, the details of the meeting have already been decided. We're in that very delicate phase right now where the details of that meeting are being decided right now, and they probably won't be hammered out until the 10th, and then the decisions will be made. But what you're suggesting, can I have the slide on the votes, please? What you're discussing right now is when they do collect, there will be a vote for who's going to be prime minister, because once they have a closing of the House, everything becomes open and it needs to start all over again. Everybody gets to vote one more time. And so typically, as there was with the LDP vote, there's a first vote if somebody, if one of the candidates, there was 9 candidates in the LDP presidential vote, this is for the prime minister. If any candidate receives 50% or more, then they're nominated, or they become the president of the LDP or the prime minister. In this particular situation, we've got the LDP, we've got Komeito, we've got several opposition parties. In the first round, it is likely that everybody is going to vote for their own leader within their political party. So that means you might have 9 candidates and everybody votes and nobody gets a majority. Then you have to go into the second round. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that process, Dan?
Yes, I know it is not completely to be ruled out that some section in Jiminto will abstain for voting in the first round, so that Ishiba-san would not be elected on the first round. But on the second round, it's winner takes all, and Ishiba-san will definitely get the position.
Right. It could happen on the first round. It distinctly will happen on the second round, because in the second round, whoever's in first place and second place, they'll be in the runoff. So it's most likely going to be Mr. Ishiba and Mr. Noda, the leader of the Constitutional Democratic Party, if there is a second round.
Yes, that's correct. And the second round, it's a winner takes all. Doesn't have to have a majority. It's just who is number 1 and who is number 2.
Right.
And the numbers are telling it will be Ishiba-san.
So you mentioned something. I don't want to get into the weeds too much, but I think our audience knows enough and is familiar enough with the dynamics that we can talk just a little bit about what you suggested. The LDP, there might be some within the LDP who withdraw from voting in the first round. And I think what you're talking about is there is animosity still with the presidential election and the fight between the Aso side of the LDP and the Kishida, Suga, Ishiba side of the LDP. They won by a margin, but there are some scores that still need to be settled. And Mr. Aso, even if the Democratic Party of the People joins into a coalition and they collect their votes, if Mr. Aso's faction, which is about 33 members, decides that they're just going to abstain, it still pushes this into the second round of the election. Can you talk about that?
No qualms with what you said. This is exactly what I think may happen. There will be people in Komeito who will abstain from voting, and that will prevent the Ishiba candidacy of getting in the first round. But then we'll move to a second round, and because of the overwhelming majority of Komeito versus its main opponent, then Ishiba-san will be appointed.
Yeah. So what's the benefit of running this kind of ploy by the Aso faction? I mean, probably he's suggesting, or it is being suggested, or maybe the LDP is watching this show and they're coming up with this new idea. He could do that or threaten to do that in exchange for some concessions for not doing it. So mind your manners, vote with everybody else, and as a consequence of that, you'll get this, this, and this. I mean, he's still got his nose out of joint because he was not made deputy prime minister, or he was made supreme advisor, which is probably a slap in the face, and I think he interpreted it that way, Dan.
Yes, but you are implying that it's only the Aso group voting, right, or abstaining from voting. But there will be, in my opinion, there will be members of different groups from Komeito who will also abstain from voting.
Yes, and
animosity towards Ishiba-san.
Yes, and we know what you're talking about. You're talking about the remnants of the Abe faction. You're talking about Sanai Takaichi. You're talking about Mr. Kobayashi, who are not part of the singular group right now under Mr. Ishiba. And in any event, Dan, we can talk about this maybe at a later date. Even though Mr. Ishiba is going to be prime minister, we pretty much predict there's very little time until the end of the year. They want to move over to a supplemental budget so that the population is a little bit happy with how things shook out. They close it down. The diet session itself is going to be very short. And then we move into the new year and the formal constitutional term of the diet starting in January.
Yes, I mean, from the 11th to the 14th will be devoted to electing the prime minister and appointing some people in both the cabinet and in the diet seats. So that will take 4 days and that will be finished. But then after, what happens to Ishiba-san is unknown. That he'd be elected prime minister on the 11th, fine, wonderful. What happens to him later, that's a different story.
So, Dan, this is something that you and I pull together just from time to time because the environment or the issues call for us to get together and to advise, the people who are very deeply involved in Japanese politics. We appreciate the audience tuning in, but this is becoming something of a regular meeting with us. I mean, we also, I think, need to meet after the 11th to talk about what happened on the 11th, who was appointed as Minister of Justice or as Minister of Agriculture, who is the Chief Cabinet Secretary. I imagine it will still be Mr. Hayashi, number 2 in the Kishida faction. What other things are going on in the background? I think the audience is going to be hungry for that kind of update. What do you think, Dan?
Yeah, I agree. I have one suggestion. Some people who might be interested should come to my breakfast meeting, and then maybe to another meeting with you and I, where we can see what things look like.
Okay.
I'll repeat my statement. Yes, it is Mr. Ishiba. Yes, but that's not the end of it.
Right. So let's just wrap it up now. I think we've talked about the hottest topic points for our audience now. I'd like to remind everybody, Dan Harada has a monthly breakfast briefing at the Capital Tokyo Hotel. Your next one is on the 14th. Is that right, Dan?
Yes.
It's a breakfast meeting. Get there at 7:30. Dan starts speaking at 8 and goes to 9. You need to register with Dan, so write to his email address. And then similarly, I have a briefing on Japanese politics one-on-one, every Sunday, talking about what's happened over the week. And then Dan and I come together on really central issues that are important, evolving, that are pretty critical, that require somebody like Dan. Dan is a member of the LDP and has a special insight and intel that he shares with us. So we invite all of you to join us there. But with that, Dan, I'd like to wrap up today's briefing. Any final closing thoughts?
No, just congratulations to Ishiba-san.
Yes. There are a couple of other people that came out better than expected, but Japanese politics, it is in incredible flux. We appreciate everybody tuning in and staying tuned to what's going on in Japanese politics. Please continue to plug in on LinkedIn and follow us as broadcast on YouTube as well. Thank you very much, everybody, for tuning in.
Thank you, everybody. Talk to you soon. See you soon.